Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. I could just give a few moments for everyone to join us, so just a moment early, so please come on in and get yourselves settled. And while you're waiting, if you would like, as usual, for those of you that have been before, please put your name in the chat, introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining us from, how your day's going, what your weather's like. Lisa is joining us today from the United States, so she is early in her morning, lunchtime here for us in the UK. So from wherever you're joining, a big warm welcome to you. Okay, so as not to lose our time, one or two people will, I suspect, will still join us, but let's go ahead and welcome Lisa. Hello, so just for those of you that don't know, my name is Mary Hodgson. I'm the Secretary of EASE. I know many of you know me, but for those that are joining for the first time, big warm welcome to you. As I say, introduce yourselves in the chat, tell us where you're joining from. And today we are joined by Lisa Janicke Hinchliffe. And Lisa is a professor and librarian from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I hope I've said that correctly. And Lisa is chair of the ORCID board. So I'm very pleased to have her along today to talk about ORCID. And Lisa will introduce this session, so the introduction to ORCID. So as I say, it's early in her morning, so we particularly thank her for being with us. So Lisa is an experienced academic librarian with expertise in information literacy, assessment and metrics, scholarly publishing communication, and librarian faculty collaboration. So I'm going to hand over to Lisa momentarily, and she will do a presentation, and then please put your questions in the Q&A and any comments in the chat. And at the end of Lisa's presentation, I'll come back and we'll take your questions and see if anyone would like to answer those live. Then we can arrange for that to happen. And we'll see how we can get some discussion going at the end. So big warm welcome to you, Lisa. Thank you so much for being with us. And I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Hopefully you are now seeing my screen. So that would be helpful.
Yes, that's all good.
Great, fantastic. Yep, everything set up here. You know how Zoom likes to change your layout as soon as you start sharing. Well, good morning from where I am, and hello to wherever you are in the world today. I'm really pleased to have a chance to share with you about persistent identifiers for people and an introduction to ORCID. I'm going to jump right in with the sort of PID space, as we call it, the persistent identifiers, tell you a little bit about ORCID, and then share with you some of our development plans and what we're working on. I really welcome for you to, make comments in the chat, ask questions, etc., and I'll try and leave plenty of time for us to have a discussion. So for those of you who are new to this kind of space, I'm going to start with the product overview, if you will, for what is ORCID. And to do that, we really need to understand what is a persistent identifier. So a persistent identifier is a globally unique thing that identifies people, places, and things. It is a singular one-to-one match. So in the case of ORCID, it's a number matches to a person. Other times, like DOIs, it's a DOI matches to an article or a data set. The notion is that they are persistent in that they are stable and reliable. They should stick around, well, forever. They are not reused. There's the idea that they are well governed. So there's an organization that's managing them, and they're technologically robust. Another thing is that they should be resolvable by humans and machines. So PIDs can be made into URLs with landing pages and underlying metadata. This whole idea that they're findable, accessible, reusable, and interoperable. So why do we use PIDs? PIDs provide clarity because they disambiguate. they say this Lisa Hinchliffe is not that Lisa Hinchliffe. And you might think, well, Lisa Hinchliffe, that's pretty unique. Well, yes, but there's still 4 of us who have a current scholarly output in the world. And then, of course, we could think about the many Michael Smiths and John Andersons and that sort of name and see how quickly this becomes a need. So they distinguish one person from another. They also facilitate sharing, reuse, and attribution by sort of collecting activity on that PID. So they create an accurate picture of that person's activity or that article's accesses. And they enable automation and interoperability. And in doing so, they save a lot of people a lot of money because they enable data to flow from one system to another in automated ways. There are PIDs for many entities. Typically these days, we talk about people, places, and things. And so for people, those are things like ORCID, Scopus ID, the ISNI. For places, we talk about Ringgold, ROR, GRID. And for things like data sets of books, articles, we have DOIs, ISSNs, ISBNs, PMICs, Ds, etc. We also have now an emerging ecosystem for grants, which is Crossref grant IDs, and projects where it's called RAID. There's a lot more as well, but these are the most common in the scholarly communications arena. PIDs are connected to each other with what's known as the PID graph. And you can see that we can sort of conceptualize that there's people who do things like write papers, write peer reviews, are members of research organizations, get grants from funders, they publish with particular publishers. And so all of these have a DOI, have a persistent identifier, which means that things like the DOI for the article can be connected to the ORCID for the person. Eventually, you can link this all up. So peer reviews are connected to the paper, peer reviews are connected to the person. All of that can be connected to the particular grant and the funder that gave that grant. Again, we do this already, just sort of much more manually. And so the idea is to automate these connections to enable all of us to then work with these data. So as I mentioned, ORCID solves the name ambiguity problem. And this is something that was going around on Twitter a few years back. I'm the 38th author and, wow, I hadn't finished. I'm the 38th author called Wang. Oh, and this links to an article in PubMed where indeed there are 38 authors named Wang, in addition to many, many other authors. So how do we know which person is who? ORCID also helps us with the challenge of name variation. By disambiguating an individual from others with the same name, we also know that many people actually are represented by multiple iterations of names. So you can see here that we have somebody who's been published in different articles as KB Ramdin, Kareem B. Ramdin, K. Ben Ramdin. And this is something that many women in the United States, at least, are familiar with because many of us change our names when we get married. Or divorced. People change their names for all sorts of reasons or go by different variations of their name. By having a consistent ORCID attached to all of those names, all of their publications and other activities can be grouped together on their ORCID record. Finally, we facilitate automation and reuse with PIDs, and you'll see this in that you can list all the other PIDs that you have as a person, say an ISNI PID, a Scopus PID, etc. And then all of your works will also have PIDs eventually, places, funders, research organizations, DOIs, and the like. Okay, so that sounds good in theory, but let's talk a little bit about how this works in practice, because it's a lot more than each person has a number. How did they get that number? How is that number system maintained? And how are those records created? So ORCID is also the name of an organization. It is the organization that keeps the ORCID registry and provides services around it. ORCID provides three main services. The first is the ORCID ID itself. This is a unique, persistent identifier that's made available free of charge to researchers. Anyone may register for one, and you may have it. There's no charge. There's also no obligation put on you by ORCID itself. However, many publishers and other organizations are now requiring people to have ORCIDs as part of the workflows. There's also the ORCID Record, or sometimes called a digital CD, that is connected to an ORCID ID. It can include employment, education, funding, peer review, research output, other metadata. And then finally, we provide APIs as well as services and support for communities of practice that use the ORCID data, use the ORCID registry, support users of the registry, and enable interoperability between ORCID records and member organizations, which might be universities, publishers, and the like. So researchers use ORCID in lots of ways in their daily work, besides as an identifier that's sort of just something they can have. When submitting a manuscript, the corresponding author might sign into the submission system for a journal using their ORCID ID. They might be given prompts to pre-fill the submission form based on data that is in their ORCID record. They can have their ORCID ID and their collaborators' ORCID IDs included in the work's metadata. They can have their ORCID record automatically updated once the work is published. Editors might review ORCID records to help with research integrity checks, to see whether this person really looks like they're a person that exists in the world. Do they have any other publication record, and do they have any other activity? Reviewers might themselves sign into the submission system using ORCID ID, be given credit for their review work by having peer review activity added to their ORCID record, etc. So ORCID IDs are authenticated when they're used. This is an example of a sign-in screen saying, would you like to sign in using ORCID? And it is enabling the person to say, yes, go ahead and use my ORCID record as my ORCID ID as a way to sign in. And then when they sign in, it automatically populates the ORCID ID, meaning that there's no chance of transcription error in entering that 16-digit number. And you'll see it also discloses to the person who is asking to use their ORCID record. Finally, it also tells them what data on the record is the person is giving permission for that entity to use. The result of which is that the authenticated ID is shared with the community on the publication, which you can see in the top half of the screen, where there's the author, and then when you mouse over the author, this last author, it gives you their contact information that includes their ORCID ID. Then on the bottom half of the screen, you can see that if you go to that person's ORCID record, it has been automatically populated via Crossref, so that once published, the article with the DOI is now appearing on the ORCID record for Lewis, as well as the other authors of this article. The ORCIDs are also shared between systems, and here's just an example of how that's represented in the metadata for the particular piece. Many systems then can reuse ORCID data. So as I mentioned, we already have the sign-in use case. There's also, in many cases, grant agencies require applicants to sign in with their ORCID and create an automatics record with all of their publications and the like for them within the granting system by data transfer from the ORCID record. In addition, researcher profiles systems, often maintained by universities, can be automatically kept up to date by feeding data from ORCID into those university systems. Now, you might have seen that I said that, that one piece of data was added by Crossref. So how does that happen? Individual people can add data to their ORCID record, but an even more powerful way of making that data appear on your record is to give permission from member organizations of ORCID to add validated information to your record for you. We call these trust markers. And the reason we call that is that they can be helpful to say, oh, there's a third party that sort of vouched for this information. So who can add that data? Research organizations can add affiliations, publishers can add outputs and reviews, funders can add funding items. All of these things can also be added by the individual themselves, with the exception of the reviewer information. Because peer review happens, if you will, behind closed doors, typically, we don't allow individuals to assert their own peer review activity. When the peer review or other activity is asserted by a third party through a validation process, you'll see that a record includes this green check mark and a statement of the provenance of that information. So I meant already that authors are disambiguated as well. And so we kind of have this workflow going both ways. Here's on the article, then onto the ORCID record, but also onto the article. So we've got that matchup. So ORCID is able to deliver value for all the players within the system across the workflows. It can be easier to sign into the journal at manuscript submission, editing and review processes, publishing. This can also help with discovery of seeing people's other works. And then, of course, something I haven't talked about yet is that it can really help with reporting. All of those exercises where people need to report on their activities, in many cases, this can be automated as well. So our idea here is to drive what we call our virtuous circle, that all of the stakeholders, by contributing to the ORCID ecosystem, also gain benefit from the ORCID ecosystem, primarily through reducing administrative burden, understanding the impact, and increasing the accuracy of the data across all of the systems. So auto update, which I've already talked about, really shows the power of persistent identifiers in the ecosystem. They add value and save time by including ORCID IDs in the DOI metadata when creating a DOI, and then DOI agencies use ORCID authentication workflows and notifications to get permission to automatically update records. And so you just see here the kind of workflows that are in place to trigger both adding ORCIDs to publisher systems and then publishers being able to push data to the ORCID system. I want to mention here that the researcher is always in charge of their record. And so if they do not wish to allow for auto updating, they can refuse that service. They can also delete things off of their record that have been added. And so one of our principles is researcher control. And so ultimately the ORCID record is under the control of the researcher. But we are enabling these efficiencies for the researcher should they be willing to take advantage of it. And let me be very clear. Most people, once they realize this can happen, are very happy to take advantage of it. Why not let Crossref put your citations onto your record rather than having to manually enter citation information yourself? So really what we're trying to do is balance researcher control and data quality. So we keep the principle of researcher control, but we incentivize practices and behaviors that increase data quality. And again, as I said, most people really value these. So researchers own their own record. control who has access to it, and can change access permissions at any time. But for data quality, we also have terms of use to prevent misrepresentation. So it is not allowed to put fake information onto your profile. We have a disputation process if people believe that data has been inaccurately added to somebody's record. We use a great deal of machine learning algorithms to detect obvious spam, and we remove those from use pending correction or withdrawal. The idea as well is that trust in an ORCID record accumulates over time. It grows. The more data that's there with more provenance helps us understand that this record is comprehensively and accurately representing an individual. Now, when somebody wants to trust what is on an ORCID record, we believe really depends on what they're doing with the ORCID record. So, at a baseline, you could have an ORCID record that's blank. Nothing is listed in the record. For many years, we had no automated ways of sort of nudging people to add information, but now we do. And because of that, we're seeing an increase in the ways that people do populate their records. But you could find a record that just has things that the researcher has self-asserted. Or you could find that there's publications added by a publisher, and education affiliation added by a university, and employment data added by a research institution, and a grant added by a funder. Any user of an ORCID record, somebody who's looking at the record, could decide how much data of what type is needed for the level of trust that they need for the particular use case. So what you need in order to allow someone to submit a manuscript might be very minimal. What you need if you're doing a research integrity investigation, you might be looking for something more. So the promise of all of the PIDs, not just ORCID, is a PID optimized research cycle, where PIDs are used throughout the research lifecycle from grant application, review, award, during the research phase, all the way through publication, reporting of outcomes, and reuse. So PIDs deliver value at every stage if they're implemented. And so we are really working on scaling implementation. ORCIDs and DOIs are very mature and ubiquitous in our systems. ROR, RAID, and grant IDs are still working to catch up. So, we're on a journey here. It's really, though, has some real financial benefits. It's estimated, for example, that if the priority PIDs, ORCIDs, DOIs, and the like, provided automation and removed the need to rekey data, could save the United Kingdom higher education sector £45 million over a 5-year period. And a similar estimate is 24 million Australian dollars every year. So, these numbers are, of course, estimates based on a lot of analysis, but that's a significant amount of savings across the ecosystem if we can ensure this, in addition to, obviously, the benefits for end users with respect to discovery and the like. So this is the administrative saving. So I'm going to move on now to ORCID as an organization. So just a few facts about us. We're an independent, not-for-profit, open to participation by all. So as I mentioned, anyone can register for an ORCID. If you don't have one, maybe you want to register for one today. Founded a few years before, the registry launched in 2012. We're guided by a set of values and founding principles, and we're committed to making fair, open data available via our public API and the annual public data file. Now, I do want to remind you that the only thing that's in the public data file are those things that researchers have said that we have permission to include in that data file. But it's significant. We have a very active researcher community. Just over 8 million researchers are active in their ORCID record at this time. And we have 1,352, close to 1,400 member organizations. So we've got individuals and organizations. Now, organizations are really key to us because their member dues are what allow us our funding in order to make the registry available to users for free. So what we want to see, our vision at ORCID, is that anyone who participates in research, scholarship, and innovation is uniquely identified and connected to their contributions across disciplines, borders, and time. So we're creating that connection between people and the work that they do in the research space. And how we're trying to enable that happening is transparent and trustworthy connections between researchers, their contributions, and their affiliations by providing this unique persistent identifier for individuals to use as they engage in research, scholarship, and innovation activities. So I mentioned everything we do is guided by our values and our founding principles. I won't read all of these for you here today, but we take these very seriously and use them as a lens or upon which to make our decisions as we make choices about how we're going to move the organization forward and what services we're going to develop for our members and for the research community. So our goal from the beginning was to develop the broadest possible trust from the communities that we serve. So we're legally incorporated in the United States as a nonprofit entity. We have open organizational membership. We have a board of directors that is elected by the members, and that's our governance body. We have legally binding membership agreements, a privacy policy that's regulated by GDPR and other national regulations, given we operate globally. And we have legally binding employment agreements, code of conduct, whistleblower policy, etc. So we're a very robust, mature organization that has good governance, legal standing, and is financially sound. We also have a number of social constructs that strengthen the trustworthiness of the ecosystem. I already mentioned our founding values and principles, our commitment to researcher control, and our commitment to open source software and fair open data. We are seeking and to build and develop and continuously iterating towards an equitable, sustainable business model and try and hold ourselves accountable by working as openly as possible within the space with the decisions that we make and our processes. Continuous community engagement and dialogue. All of these things build the trust fabric of ORCID as an organization. The registry turned 10 in 2022, and that was a very exciting time for us, especially since you can see that we started in concept in 2009. So from 2009 to 2012, there was the development of the organization, the concept, the technologies, etc., the initial funding. And then we had 10 years of very significant growth. We actually reached our 10 millionth ORCID ID after only 8 years. Now, in 10 years, we launched the Global Participation Fund, which is our equity program. And here in 2024, we're about to kick off brainstorming for our next strategic plan and the way that we're going to grow and develop. So I've mentioned the ORCID community or our members quite a bit, so I'd like to just share with you a little bit more. We have broad adoption around the world. There are users in 250 countries, which is almost every country on the planet. We have member organizations in 58 countries. These slides are from January 2024. So a couple months ago, we had 27 national consortia and 1 regional consortia, in addition to our individual members. So it's 8.1 million active researchers, about 1,400 organizational members, And then I just want to mention as well our 5,500 active system integrations. And that's integrations with things like editorial systems, campus research management systems, any number of systems, granting agencies, etc. So we're heavily embedded into the infrastructure of the systems that support the research ecosystem as well. All of this, develops, as I mentioned already, benefits for researchers. I won't read all of these because you can look at the slides later. Benefits for universities and research institutions, benefits for publishers, benefits for funders and facilities, benefits for governments and policymakers, for vendors and service providers. We've worked very hard to present the use case for value to all of the different stakeholders in our ecosystem. Many countries and funders also adopt ORCID as part of their research strategies. And you'll just see examples here pulled from the various texts. For example, we have the NIH in the US. We have things in Panama. We have Australia National Data Service, the UKRI in the UK, and the European Commission. So you can see this, that we, again, not only technically integrated, but integrated within policy. I mentioned as well here that ORCID is increasingly part of the research security conversation. I think we're all aware of concerns around cybersecurity, geopolitical security, various other things. And in the research security ecosystem, ORCID also is helping play a role for securing the ecosystem and starting to sort of see the way that these disclosures can help with research security. 5 of the G7 countries have adopted ORCID and other PIDs as part of their research security strategies. So how do we get people to actually, become members and support the adoption of ORCIDs by individuals? Because we need individuals to get ORCIDs, but I think we all know that researchers are very busy doing research. And, building the research ecosystems infrastructure is not something they've probably thought much about. They're probably not against it. It's just not their personal passion and priority. So one of the things we do is to make sure that all of the systems that are asking people to use ORCID and to disclose ORCID data to them are certified service providers through best practice integrations. So we have criteria in order to serve service providers in 4 different scholarly workflows. I'm not sure why that says 5. And really sort of make sure people are following best practices. We have a long list of those integrators that adhere to our best practices. And these are just a couple of examples. And as people who did editing, I'm sure you'll recognize a number of them. We also have multiple initiatives to drive global participation. And 2 of our most recent innovations are our Global Participation Program and our regional consortia. The Global Participation Program is a 2-pronged approach to achieving equity and participation. The Global Participation Program has a membership equity program to address issues where we don't have equity globally. And the second is our Global Participation Fund. Let me unpack each of those for you. Our membership equity program is discounted membership fee structure for consortium members. And this is a particularly significant discounting system. It is an 80% discount for low-income countries and a 50% discount for low to middle-income countries, lower middle-income countries. We also lowered our threshold for a consortium to 3 members. So you need 3 member organizations to come together and form a consortium, and then you can take advantage of these discounts. ORCID membership isn't super expensive, but in parts of the world, our membership fees are prohibitive. And so this is a structure that we have to discount those. It is fully funded by ORCID, taking other revenues and applying them in this way. In particular, applying them this is just built into our financial model. Members who are paying the full membership fee in consortia still get value from having the rest of the world connected to ORCID. So again, we see a real virtuous circle happening here. We also have the Global Participation Fund, and this is comprised of 2 grant programs. And what are these 2 grant programs? The first is the Community Development and Outreach Fund, which funds local partners to build ORCID communities of practice in the Global South, trying to catalyze this kind of consortia development activity, and then support technical integration. The second one supports technical integration to fund the development of systems that are likely to drive participation in the Global South. So since the Global South may rely on different technologies for infrastructure than other parts of the world, we may need to help with the technological development of those systems to enable technology integration. This was made possible by the generosity of ORCID's founding lenders. I mentioned that we had startup funding. That startup funding was in the form of loans from a number of publishers. Those loans came due at the 10th year of the ORCID registry. And we made a proposition to those publishers and said, if you will forgive these loans, we have the money to pay you, but if you will forgive these loans, we will take that money and drive global participation through this fund. And I'm very grateful that our funders forgave more than $1 million in loans to ORCID. And so that means we have $1 million to invest globally in this equity program. The structure of the program supports a lot of grantees across the globe to spread the risk and increase the chance of positive outcomes. We have 2 grant cycles per year, about 5 grants per cycle, and most of the grants are $5,000 to $20,000. Grantees also get the benefit of a dedicated ORCID support staff contact, an invitation to participate in our grantee forum and community, invitations to community events, invitations to various member events, and inclusion in our ongoing communications program. So our goal here is our strategic objective to increase global participation by focusing on particular communities, and particular to remedy those ORCID participation gaps by providing grants to communities practice in low and lower middle income countries, build understanding and use of ORCIDs in local contexts, and create and enhance technological integrations to support these communities. So we have a lot going on, and at some point in creating these slides, you just have to stop and say, okay, this is probably already going to be a little bit overwhelming. So as I promised, I wanted to keep plenty of time for us to have some questions, to see what you're thinking about PIDs generally and ORCID specifically, and to see what other ideas we might have for how we can strengthen that virtuous circle, strengthen the trust factor, and see how ORCIDs can provide better value throughout the research ecosystem. So I am going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was such a lot of information, and I was really, overwhelmed with how much you'd got there, but that was really fascinating. Thank you. So I think, yes, you've bombarded our audience a bit, but I wonder if it might be possible for people to pop in the chat how many of you are already ORCID, already have an ORCID ID. Would that be a useful thing to do? Can I wake everybody up and say, yeah, if you have a ORCID ID, pop it. We don't have a huge thing here, so pop that in the chat. And also, I think it was really fascinating to learn how you were doing you know, that obviously you had focused on the kind of Western Europe and the Americas, and now, you know, like reaching out to the sort of the global South and other parts of the world, which obviously for us in EASE, we've got our regional chapters spread across,
Right.
you know, across a lot of those areas. So very interesting for us to look at that as well. So, okay, so don't be shy, guys. Do we have any questions? Let's have a look at our Q&A. So that person's just asking about the recording. So yes, indeed, we have a this is being recorded today, and you'll get an email in the next couple of days with the link to that recording so that you'll be able to go over, because that was a lot of information. So let's see if we can encourage someone to have a chat. Would anybody just like to have a discussion with Lisa? I feel like here's where I feel like I'm not talking to anybody.
I know. It's in the chat, so
there we go.
Yeah, are there people who don't want to participate in ORCID, and why? I think there are some people who sort of you know, they sometimes wonder about, you know, a number. I'm being reduced to a number. And this question of sort of, a lot of people can also sort of, you know, they might object to the way that researchers are evaluated in quantitative ways. And so they don't really want to enable that. So, you know, what I talked about how, oh, this adds value because it decreases administrative burden and that sort of thing. For some people, they're not interested in decreasing that administrative burden. So, I mean, I don't think this is the thing that people are sort of most objecting to. And I think eventually it's now socialized at this point that people are not objecting. I think people still really appreciate having control over their record, because one of the things we do know is that researchers sometimes don't appreciate the way Google Scholar just automatically sort of aggregates their things and they can't correct it. Or same thing with, say, ResearchGate or academia.edu. They just don't feel like they have that same level of control, even their own institutions' web pages about them, right? And so I think one of the things that they do really appreciate about ORCID, and that can often make them see the value, is this is under your control of what's made public on your record. So you can have an ORCID and not allow anything on your record, and still have the ORCID that's sort of required by your granting agency or the like. So, but I think what we're seeing is that people are pretty excited to have a record of their work that they actually can edit and control. So the idea that you can sort of have this populated for you brings a lot of value. So it's a pretty small number of people who are sort of objecting.
Okay, so we have a couple of things there. Yeah. So Megan, she's in an office with lots of other people, so sadly she can't put her mic on and talk to us, but she was explaining that, you know, back in the day when she was a PhD student, the ORCID wasn't really available at that time. And so, you know, so obviously there'll be a lot of people in that situation, won't there, where things have moved on a lot. But I was wondering, for those of you that are editors in this audience, you know, how it's sort of affecting you as editors, how much it's made your lives easier in terms of submitting authors, and, you know, just as you say, just being able to do that minefield of people having combinations of names that they use in different formats. And especially for us, we have a lot of you know, that's Asian, Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese authors, and their names are often the other way around, you know, first and last names are often interspersed. So that I feel like it would be a really big benefit for editors as well as for authors. Right, Vishali says, I have an ORCID from PhD days and I still get my industry magazine articles added to it. So that's all good.
Yeah. So that's one of the things I was gonna say. Like, I can say, I mean, I don't know what Megan's specific situation, so I'm just gonna use it as kind of a jumping off point.
Sure.
It can still be sort of valuable to people if I can imagine a number of cases to see that you were an active researcher at one point, right? So that's part of the benefit you bring to other jobs, for example. And so it can be a mechanism for saying, well, I do have this work in my past. Um, so that's one possibility. As somebody else mentioned, there is the industry publications that actually use ORCIDs as well, and so drive that activity to your record. It is also possible to input, for example, your employment and conference presentations, because conference presentations don't really flow very easily because they're just not under much control. But you can add those yourself. So I think it partially also depends about whether or not the people that you're trying to reach with your history and background are likely to be looking there, or is there a way, for example, if you're primarily more using LinkedIn for your sort of your professional profile, but LinkedIn doesn't really display academic work that well, and so maybe there's value in sort of representing it somewhere else and then linking to it from your LinkedIn. So I think there's a lot of ways to think about that. Edson asked here too about sort of journalism. That's not our use case. We're not trying to aggregate up the journalistic outputs. So there's this in-between space, right, which is the industry trade publications. Those would, somewhat be, but, ultimately, if it's a publication, we're not going to prevent it from somebody adding it. So, for example, I, as a researcher, have published things in, if you will, the press. I have to manually add those. No newspaper is like pushing things to an ORCID record. They're not members of ORCID. They can't write to the record, but it might be valuable to me to go ahead and add that manually.
Sure. And can you respond to Megan's point there about could ORCID records be more easily searchable for topics?
Yeah, so Megan, that's an interesting thing that no one has ever said to me before, that they are trying to search by topic per se. So I'll say that I don't know is the real answer of like whether it can be made easier, but what I can say is that I know that a lot of the services that sell a peer review finder service to a publisher are bringing in ORCID data as part of that. Into that system. So I'm not exactly sure topically is the way we've really thought about this, because our system is primarily oriented around individuals. But I'm also sort of having this vague memory in the back of my head that we're doing some work on a taxonomy. And I just can't remember the details enough of that to tell you about it here today. But Megan, I'll be sure to bring this idea back to the staff and at least raise it for whether it's on the roadmap or is it something that we want to invest. Sorry, I'm grabbing a pencil, so that wasn't, whether we want to investigate this or is this something that we could do something about that. So
yeah, because
I appreciate bringing that up.
It feels like it would be a relatively easy step and would, as you say, from an editor's perspective, would give them a lot of a lot of scope to be able to search for peer review. Let's say they were, looking for a peer reviewer on a particular topic, to actually be able to say who are the people, or who are the head of their field in research on this topic.
I definitely don't think we'll be getting to the point where we would be telling you that this is the person at the head of their field, because that sounds a little bit like Scopus and Web of Science kind of data, right? Because that's a comparative analysis, which is beyond representing the individuals. But I would just have to find out
okay,
more about that. So that's a great, I won't say no to any of these because it's not my place. I'm the chair of the board, which is our governance body, our member governance body. We have about 40 people working for ORCID who actually make the technology work, know what our infrastructures are, ensure the privacy and security of the data, do all the training, all that sort of thing. So I always really want to be in a position as a member of the board and the chair to be like, that's not my lane, but I'm happy to be a conduit for this kind of idea. So, and I'm going to say too, like, if you have an idea next week, just hit the ORCID website and send us a message.
Yeah,
we
perfect.
are very happy to have feedback from our community at any point in time.
Okay. So Vishali has forgiven us a long piece of chat here, but sometimes authors, in response to the journal publishers' requirements, create and provide their ORCIDs, but sometimes those have zero publicity available information regarding affiliations and credentials on those pages. This doesn't help much to check further in case there is a publishing ethics related concern. He's wondering how publishers could encourage authors to engage more meaningfully in the ORCID ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yes, a blank ORCID record is not as valuable of an ORCID record for the end users. So there's a couple things that we've been really working on knowing this, which is primarily the thing we've done is at the time when somebody creates an ORCID record, we now have a prompting workflow that encourages them to immediately put data into the system. And it has been a massive uptick in new accounts that are created having actual data in them. And so one of the things we just realized is, if you want people to do something, you need to make it easy. And so we've done a lot of work to make it easy. Now, that only helps with new records, obviously. So it doesn't help us with the sort of existing unpopulated records. And that's something that I really appreciate, the idea that, that editors and publishers might be thinking about. One of those things, certainly for publishers that are a member of Crossref, is to make sure that they are taking advantage of the auto update process. And even if somebody at some point was asked about Crossref's auto update and they denied it, they can go back in and turn it on. And so publishers might be wishing to help us push out to the ORCID users, hey, turn this on. We are not going to ask them again, right? Because that's like a principle of privacy. Once you've asked people if you want something and they've told you no, you have to respect that. But a publisher could say, hey, why don't you go in to this integration and turn this on? And that would obviously auto-update, which would really help. I think the other thing is just talking to your authors and editors about the ways that the ORCIDs are being used and why it's so useful and helpful to have a populated record. I think though the case in particular, when you're investigating somebody for research integrity or paper mill, they may not be the most inclined to, spill their cards by saying, well, I don't have anything to list. So it's a little bit of a challenge in that way, but we certainly we are seeing an uptick with the things that we have managed to put in place. And we certainly would love to see, if we can come up with other automated things, it really helps. Because what really helps is creating something where researchers, it makes it easy for them.
Okay, so let's do this final question from Edson. So what happens when a paper is retracted? Does that information get back into the ORCID record or through Crossref, or is it up to the author to deal with it?
So remembering what ORCID is actually doing, which is we are writing metadata that is provided through an automated workflow to the record. If the metadata doesn't get updated, then there's no data flow to the ORCID record. Okay. Now with the new NISO standard around the way that things should be documented and tagged if they are retracted, we may see some of that metadata flowing into ORCID records. Now, I do want to be clear, though, that if there starts to be metadata that say the word redacted is put in the title field before the title, I don't know what they're considering per se, then that will flow to the record, right? Because it'll be a metadata update. Now, whether the researcher will then say, I'm going to delete that record from my profile will be theirs. So, you know, this is that balancing. So it won't be misrepresenting that, you know, but it may not be present if a researcher decides to delete it. So I would not rely on ORCID records for any number of reasons for the information about whether something has been redacted or sorry, retracted.
Retracted, sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
But again, we just always have to think about it's like what's actually populating the record versus sort of what a human being might be able to discern if they looked at, you know, the article itself. So it's got to be in the metadata, and it has to be in a metadata field that is flowing into the ORCID record.
Perfect. So thank you, Lisa. That was really, really insightful, brilliant questions there from everybody. So just before we leave, I've just popped in the chat there a few events that are coming up at EASE over the next month or so. I will add these to tomorrow's email, so don't worry that you can't link to them here directly. I'll add it all tomorrow so that you can just come directly to the pages. And if you're interested in booking onto those courses, so some of them are free, some of them are fee paying. But we have an EASE India webinar, a sort of workshop on understanding the academic publishing workflow in August. That's coming up quite soon on the 6th. And then at the beginning of September, right through September, we have our EASE School for Manuscript Editors and Academic Authors. So this is a 4-week course with 4 modules, 1 a week for 4 weeks. Then we've got an EDI webinar looking at case studies from the Lancet group in early September. A bit later on in September, one looking at AI as a sustainable writing and translation aid in scholarly publishing. And then in October, we have our, for those of you that are journal editors, we have our editorial school for journal editors. This is part 2 of the course. So modules 5 to 8, we ran modules 1 to 4 in the spring, and 5 to 8 are going to be run through October. So again, that's another fee-bearing course, but I'll send you all the details of these tomorrow. And then just 2 dates for your diary, really, looking forward. We've got an online conference at the end of November on the 26th, which is a single day. So get that note in your diary. And then our big one, our 18th EASE conference on to be held between the 14th and the 16th of May next year. And this will be a hybrid conference. So we're going to be in Oslo. They're hosted by the Norwegian Medical Society, and will also be available for those of you that need to join online as well. So lovely to hear from you, Lisa. Thank you so much for doing that. You've got lots of nice great news about the prompt workflow for new ORCID. It sounds like that's a plan. Okay. All right.
I do want to also say there was a question in the Q&A. We were so focused on the chat. And so there's the question about whether people get multiple different PIDs for themselves. And I just wanted to add that there's mapping between them. So if you have a Scopus ID, you can list that on your ORCID record as well. And then that will also help with data flow from Scopus, for example.
Perfect. Okay, everybody, that's great to see you all. As I say, hopefully see you at something else again soon, but have a great summer, those of you that are going off on your holidays, and go and get some breakfast, Lisa. It's sweet of you to join us so early.
Time for some coffee. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.